Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. It happened in the year 2019. The world was different then, simpler in some ways, more complex in others. I never imagined that a simple camping trip could change my life forever, but looking back now I realize that's exactly what it did. My name is Travis Gordon, and I've always been a fighter. Growing up in a small town on the outskirts of St. Louis, I learned early on that nothing comes easy. My parents worked long hours at the local factory, leaving me to fend for myself more often than not. I scraped by in school, not because I lacked intelligence, but because I was too busy working part-time jobs to keep food on the table. After high school, I bounced from job to job, always searching for something better, something that could give me the life I dreamed of. It wasn't until I hit my 30s that things started to turn around. I landed a job in sales, and it turned out I had a knack for it. Years of struggle had taught me how to read people, how to connect with them, and how to close a deal. By the time I turned 40, I had worked my way up to regional manager. It wasn't an easy climb. I faced more setbacks than I care to remember. Failed relationships, financial struggles, and moments of self-doubt plagued me along the way. But I persevered, driven by a determination born from years of hardship. That spring, I decided it was time for a break. The constant grind of work had left me feeling burnt out, and I knew I needed to recharge. That's when I got the idea to rent an RV and take a trip to the Ozarks. I had always loved nature, and the thought of spending a few weeks surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests seemed like the perfect escape. I remember the day I set out like it was yesterday. The sun was shining, and there was a feeling of excitement in the air. As I drove out of the city, watching the buildings give way to open fields, and then to the beginnings of the Ozark forests, I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced in years. The RV campsite I had chosen was tucked away deep in the heart of the Ozarks. It was a small, family-owned place, far from the more touristy areas. When I arrived, I was struck by the beauty of the surroundings. Dense, sprawling woods stretched as far as the eye could see, broken only by the occasional clearing or bubbling stream. I parked my RV in a secluded spot by a creek, the sound of trickling water a soothing backdrop to the rustling of leaves in the breeze. As I set up camp, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace wash over me. This, I thought, was exactly what I needed. The first few days were idyllic. I spent my time hiking the nearby trails, fishing in the creek, and simply enjoying the serenity of nature. In the evenings, I'd sit outside my RV, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. It was during one of these peaceful evenings that everything changed. I had just finished my dinner and was about to turn in for the night when I heard it, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. It was a low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, perhaps a bear or a mountain lion. But deep down, I knew this was something different. The sound came again, closer this time, and I felt my heart begin to race. I quickly retreated into my RV, locking the door behind me. As I peered out the window into the gathering darkness, I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. Something large was moving through the underbrush, just out of sight. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the RV, every rustle of leaves outside had me on edge. When morning finally came, I convinced myself that I had let my imagination run wild. After all, I was a city boy, not used to the sounds of the wilderness. I decided to shake off my fears with a long hike. As I made my way deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming just days before, now felt oppressive and threatening. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. It was then that I stumbled upon the cabin. Hidden away in a small clearing, it looked like something out of an old horror movie. The wood was weathered and gray, the windows dark and lifeless. A part of me wanted to turn back, to return to the safety of my RV, but curiosity got the better of me. As I approached, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I called out, but no one answered. Cautiously, I pushed the door open, wincing at the loud creak that echoed through the forest. The interior was dark and musty. dust particles dancing in the few shafts of sunlight that managed to penetrate the gloom. In the center of the room stood an old table, surrounded by a few chairs, one of which was overturned. On the table lay an assortment of objects, a rusted lantern, some empty cans, and a yellowed notebook that immediately caught my eye. I picked up the notebook, its pages brittle with age. As I flipped through it, I found sketches of the surrounding landscape and detailed notes about the area. But it was the last few entries that made my blood run cold. They spoke of strangers in the woods, of noises in the night, and of items mysteriously disappearing from the cabin. The final entry, dated just a few weeks prior, simply read, "They're getting closer." A sense of dread washed over me. I knew I needed to get back to my RV, to safety. As I hurried back along the trail, the forest seemed different. Every shadow looked like a potential threat, every sound a warning. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. When I finally reached my RV, I locked myself inside, my heart pounding. As night fell, I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that the notebook was probably just the ramblings of some paranoid hermit. But then I heard it again, that low, guttural growl from the night before. This time it was closer, much closer. I peered out the window, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but revealing nothing but trees and shadows. The growl came again, followed by a heavy thud against the side of the RV. The whole vehicle shook with the impact. Panic set in as I heard footsteps circling the RV. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human. I grabbed my hunting knife, holding it with trembling hands as I backed away from the windows. Suddenly, with a deafening crash, the window beside the door shattered. A pair of hands, if you could call them that, gripped the window frame. They were gnarled and twisted with long, sharp claws that easily tore through the remaining glass. I shouted, brandishing my knife, and the hands withdrew, but only for a moment. In the silence that followed, I heard the sound of something being dragged through the underbrush. Cautiously, I approached the broken window and peered out. What I saw made my blood freeze. A figure, hunched and inhuman, was disappearing into the woods, dragging what looked horribly like a human body behind it. I knew I couldn't stay in the RV. With the window broken, it was no longer safe. I quickly packed a backpack with essentials, and armed with my knife and flashlight, slipped out into the night. The forest was eerily silent as I made my way towards what I hoped was the direction of the main road. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me spinning around, expecting to see those twisted hands reaching for me. After what felt like hours of walking, I saw a flicker of light ahead. As I approached, I realized it was a campfire. 3 men were huddled around it, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. They looked rough, with unkempt beards and dirty clothes. Despite my misgivings, I knew I needed help. I stepped into the firelight, my hands raised. "Hey, I need help," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The men turned to look at me, their expressions unreadable in the flickering light. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, stood up. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice gruff. I explained about the break-in at my RV and what I had seen in the woods. The men exchanged glances, and for a moment I felt a surge of hope. Maybe they could help me get to safety. The tall man motioned for me to sit by the fire. "We've been seeing some strange things out here too," he said, his tone softer now. "People going missing, weird noises at night. You're lucky you found us." As we talked, I began to relax a little. They offered me food and water, and we shared stories about our experiences in the woods. But as the night wore on, I noticed something strange. The men seemed to be watching me closely, their eyes lingering on my backpack and knife. Unease crept over me once again. I stood up, thanking them for their help, and made an excuse about needing to get back to my RV. The tall man stood as well, blocking my path. "Why don't you stay the night?" he suggested, his smile not reaching his eyes. "It's not safe out there." "Thanks, but I really should go," I insisted, trying to move around him. That's when he grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. "I wasn't asking," he said, his voice menacing now. The other men stood up, surrounding me. Panic surged through me, and I pulled away, swinging my knife at the tall man. The blade caught his arm, and he let out a grunt of pain. I took the opportunity to run, hearing their shouts behind me as I disappeared into the darkness. I ran blindly, crashing through the underbrush, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear them chasing me, their footsteps close behind. I stumbled over a root, falling hard and losing my flashlight. Scrambling to my feet, I kept running, my only thought to get as far away as possible. Suddenly I burst into a clearing, and there it was, the abandoned cabin. I had come full circle. Desperate, I ran inside, slamming the door behind me and shoving the table against it. As I caught my breath, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A trapdoor in the floor. Without hesitation, I pried it open and climbed down into a small, dark cellar, pulling the door shut above me. I crouched in the darkness, holding my knife and listening to the sounds above. The men burst into the cabin, their heavy footsteps echoing through the floorboards. They searched the room, overturning furniture and cursing in frustration. Then the trapdoor creaked open. I held my breath as one of the men peered down into the cellar, his flashlight beam sweeping the small space. I pressed myself against the wall, praying he wouldn't see me. After what felt like an eternity, he moved away, and I heard the trapdoor close. They continued to search for a while longer, but eventually their voices faded, and the cabin fell silent. I waited in the cellar for hours, too scared to move. When I finally emerged, the cabin was empty, and the first light of dawn was breaking through the trees. I made my way back to my RV, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I reached it, I found the door wide open, and the interior ransacked. Whoever had broken in had taken everything of value. I knew I couldn't stay there, so I started the engine and drove away, my hands shaking on the wheel. As I drove, I couldn't help but think about the creature I had seen, the men in the woods, and the body being dragged away. Who were they? What were they doing out there? And most importantly, what would have happened to me if I hadn't escaped? I reported the incident to the local authorities when I reached the nearest town, giving them as much information as I could. They assured me they would investigate, but I knew it was unlikely they would find anything. The woods had a way of hiding secrets. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to put the experience behind me. I threw myself back into work, hoping the routine would help me forget. But the memories of those nights in the Ozarks haunted me. I found myself jumping at shadows, waking up in cold sweats, the sound of that inhuman growl echoing in my dreams. I sought therapy, trying to make sense of what had happened. My therapist suggested it might have been a combination of stress, isolation, and an overactive imagination. A part of me wanted to believe her, to accept a rational explanation, but deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. As time passed, I began to heal. The nightmares became less frequent, the memories less vivid, but I never forgot. I never went camping again, and the sight of dense forests always sent a shiver down my spine. Years later, I came across a news article about a series of disappearances in the Ozarks. The details were vague, but they sparked something in me. I thought about contacting the authorities, about sharing what I had seen, but in the end, I decided against it. Who would believe me? Sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself thinking about that cabin in the woods, about the creature dragging its victim away, about the men around the campfire. I wonder if they're still out there, hidden in the depths of the forest, waiting for unsuspecting travelers to stumble into their domain. The experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. It taught me that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows of our civilized world. It taught me to trust my instincts, to be wary of the unknown. But most of all, it taught me to appreciate the safety and comfort of the life I had built for myself. The Ozarks showed me a darkness I never knew existed, a primal fear that I carry with me to this day. And while a part of me wishes I could forget, another part knows that remembering keeps me alert, keeps me alive. So I continue to live my life, always looking forward, but never forgetting what lies hidden in the heart of the wilderness. Because sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we never see coming. It happened in the year 2016. What was meant to be a relaxing camping trip to Bryce Canyon turned into a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. My name. A true account of the horrors I encountered in the seemingly peaceful wilderness of Utah. I had always been more of a city person, comfortable with the hustle and bustle of urban life. Software engineer, but the stress of long hours and impossible deadlines had started to take its toll. My therapist suggested a solo trip to reconnect with nature, to find myself away from the constant know that what I would find in those red rock canyons was far from the peace I was seeking. I arrived at Bryce Canyon National Park on a crisp October morning. The air was cool and rain. As I maneuvered my rented RV through the winding roads, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The towering hoodoos cast long shadows across the landscape, their twisted form eternal agony. Finding a secluded spot to park, I set up camp and decided to stretch my legs with a hike. The trail I chose seemed innocuous enough, a moderately difficult canyon. As I set off, the crunch of gravel under my boots was the only sound. The further I ventured, the more oppressive the silence became. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the very life had been sucked out of the area. I tried to shake off the growing sense of dread, focusing instead on the breathtaking vistas that opened up before me. The first sign that something was terribly wrong. Nestled between, torn and blood-stained. My heart raced as I approached it cautiously. The contents were strewn about: a shattered phone, a mangled map, and a journal with entries that sent chills down my spine. The last entry, dated just 2 days prior, read, "They're coming. God help me, they're coming. If anyone finds this, run, run." I would have turned back right then and there, but curiosity, that damned human trait, propelled me forward. I had to know what had happened to the owner of this backpack. As I pressed on, but deeper into a part of the canyon I was sure wasn't on any official map. The air grew colder, and an unnatural mist began to curl around my ankles. That's when I heard it. A low gut. At once, I froze, my eyes darting around wildly. The mist was thickening, obscuring my vision, and then I saw them, eyes gleaming in the gathering darkness. Dozens of animal eyes. They were too intelligent, too malevolent. Vaguely humanoid, but wrong in ways my mind struggled to comprehend. Its limbs were too long, its skin a sickly gray that seemed to shift and writhe, and its face... God, its face was a nightmare of twisted features and razor-sharp teeth. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, my lungs burning, my legs pumping. Their inhuman shrieks echoing off the canyon walls. Branches whipped at my face, rocks cut into my hands as I scrambled over obstacles. I don't know how long I ran, or how I found my way back to... Out of the tree line, gasping and sobbing, I was met with... They said I was babbling incoherently about monsters and mist. The park rangers were called. They searched the area I described, but found nothing out of the ordinary. No backpack, no strange mist, no inhuman creatures. They chalked it up to altitude sickness, maybe coupled with dehydration. But I know what those twisted canyons, and I know that somewhere in Bryce Canyon, hidden from the well-trodden paths, there's a darkness waiting. A hunger that's far from human. I left the park that very night, or far away, but distance hasn't dulled the memory. I hear those unearthly howls, and I wonder, what if they followed me home? As the weeks passed, I tried to convince myself it had all been a hallucination. I threw myself back into work, coding late into the night, hoping exhaustion would keep the nightmares at bay. But the memories lingered, festering. After my return, when the first sign appeared that the horror wasn't confined. Walking home from the office one night, the streets of Seattle shrouded in a thick fog that had rolled in from the bay. As I passed an alley, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, that same low guttural growl. I ran, my dress shoes slapping against the wet pavement. I could hear something moving behind me. When I reached my apartment building, I fumbled with my keys, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I slammed it shut behind me and leaned against it, gasping for breath. Imagination playing tricks on me, but as I left from outside of my door, scratches that hadn't been there the night before, I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, fleeting shadows that disappeared when I turned to look. The mist that had chased me through Bryce Canyon seemed to follow me, creeping under my door at night, bringing with it whispers in a language. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat. My work began to suffer and my colleagues started to worry. I could see the concern in their eyes mixed with fear. They thought I was losing my mind. Maybe Dr. Eleanor Vance, a parapsychologist I found, the goal of my story, but as I shared more details, her interest grew. She agreed to meet me, to investigate what was happening. Dr. Vance arrived at my apartment on a rainy Tuesday evening. Her hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. As soon as she crossed the threshold, she froze. "There's something here," she whispered, her face pale. "Something." We spent hours going over my experiences, Dr. Vance taking copious notes. As the night wore on, the atmosphere in the apartment grew heavy, oppressive. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, and more than once I caught a glimpse of something moving just out of sight. Around midnight, the power went out. In the sudden darkness, we heard it. Oh, inside the apartment. Dr. Vance grabbed. "We need to leave," she hissed, "now." We fumbled our way to the door, but it wouldn't open. Something was holding it shut from the other side. The growling grew louder, closer. In the dip, the shadows, it was one of them, the creatures from Bryce Canyon. But here in the confines of my small apartment, it seemed even more terrifying. Dr. Vance began to chant in a language I didn't recognize, her voice growing louder as the creature advanced. The air crackled with an unseen energy, and for a moment, when I saw our chance, I grabbed a heavy lamp from the nearby table and hurled it at the window. The glass shattered, and without a second thought, I pulled Dr. Vance toward the opening. We climbed out onto the fire escape, the cold rain soaking us instantly. Behind us, I could hear the creature howling in rage. We clattered down the metal stairs, not daring to look back. We ran through the empty streets, the sound of pursuit never far behind. It wasn't until we reached a 24-hour diner, brightly lit and full of people, that we finally stopped. As we burst through the doors, the other patrons stared at us in shock, two soaped, terrified people gasping for breath. Over coffee, Dr. Vance explained her theory. The creatures I had encountered weren't of this world. They were ancient beings, once worshipped by long-forgotten cultures. The hoodoos of Bryce Canyon had been a prison, designed to keep them contained. But something, perhaps my presence, perhaps something else, had weakened their bonds. "They're free now," she said grimly, "and they're hungry, hungry for the world they once ruled." In the days that followed, Dr. Vance and I worked tirelessly to understand what we were dealing with. We pored over ancient texts, consulted with experts in obscure mythologies, and prepared as best we could for the horrors we knew were coming. Reports started to trickle in from across the country. Mysterious disappearances in national parks, strange sightings in urban areas, a growing sense of unease that seemed to permeate every corner of society. We knew we had to return to Bryce Canyon. Whatever had started there, whatever prison had been breached, it was the key to stopping this before it spread further. But as we prepared for the journey, we were acutely aware that we might be walking into a trap. The creature that had attacked us in my apartment was just the beginning. We were about to face an ancient evil, one that had been waiting millennia for this moment. And as we set out for Utah, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were already too late. The drive to Bryce Canyon was tense. Every mile brought us closer to the source of the horror, and the weight of our mission pressed down on us. Dr. Vance spent most of the journey poring over her notes, muttering to herself in languages I didn't understand. As we neared the park, the landscape began to change. The vibrant colors of the rock formations seemed muted, as if the very life was being drained from them. A heavy mist clung to the ground, thickening as we approached. We parked at the same spot where I had begun my fateful hike months ago. The air was unnaturally still, no birdsong, no rustle of wind through the trees, just an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow every sound we made. Dr. Vance pulled out a bag filled with strange objects, crystals, herbs, and things I couldn't even begin to identify. She handed me an amulet, its surface covered in intricate symbols. "This might offer some protection," she said grimly. "But remember, our minds are our strongest defense. Whatever you see, whatever you hear, don't let it break your will." We set off down the trail, every step taking us deeper into a nightmare. The mist swirled around us, sometimes taking shapes that vanished when I tried to focus on them. More than once I thought I heard whispers, fragments of words in that inhuman language I remembered from the canyon. As we reached the point where I had found the backpack months ago, Dr. Vance suddenly stopped. Her face had gone pale, her eyes wide with a terror I had never seen before. "They know we're here," she whispered. "They're coming." The mist thickened, becoming almost solid. And then, emerging from the whiteness, came the creatures. Dozens of them, their twisted forms even more horrifying in the daylight. They moved with an unnatural grace, their eyes fixed on us with a hunger that was palpable. Dr. Vance began to chant, her voice growing stronger with each word. The amulet around my neck grew warm, pulsing with an energy I could feel but not see. The creatures hesitated, some of them shrieking in what sounded like pain. But it wasn't enough. They kept coming, and I knew that in moments we would be overwhelmed. That's when I saw it. A crack in the rock face behind us, pulsing with an eerie light. Somehow I knew this was what we had come for. This was the weakened prison, the breach that had allowed these horrors into our world. "The crack," I shouted to Dr. Vance. "We need to seal it." She nodded, understanding instantly. As the creatures closed in, we backed towards the glowing fissure. Dr. Vance's chanting grew more intense, the words seeming to take physical form in the air around us. The creatures lunged, their claws reaching for us. I felt a searing pain as one of them caught my arm, but I didn't let go of Dr. Vance. We reached the crack just as the horde was upon us. What happened next I can hardly describe. There was a flash of light so bright it felt like my eyes were burning. The creatures screamed, a sound of such anguish and rage that I thought my eardrums would burst. And then, silence. When my vision cleared, the creatures were gone. The mist had dissipated, and the canyon looked as it always had, beautiful, serene, and completely ordinary. The crack in the rock was gone, sealed as if it had never existed. Dr. Vance collapsed beside me, exhausted but alive. We had done it. We had sealed the breach, sent the horrors back to whatever dark dimension they had come from. But as we made our way back to civilization, as we told our story to disbelieving authorities and skeptical scientists, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The world had brushed against an ancient evil, and such encounters leave scars. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake in the night, certain I've heard that low, guttural growl. I see shapes in the mist that shouldn't be there, and I wonder, did we really win? Or did we just delay the inevitable? One thing I know for certain, I'll never look at the beauty of nature the same way again. Because now I know what can lurk behind it, waiting in the shadows, hungry for a world it once called its own. It happened in the year 2010. Life had always thrown curveballs my way, but I never could have imagined the terror that awaited me in the dense forests of the Olympic National Park. My name is Ethan Callahan, and this is the true story of how a simple RV trip turned into a nightmarish ordeal that still haunts me to this day. I had been working as a software developer in Seattle for the past 5 years, and the constant pressure of deadlines and office politics had begun to wear me down. When my therapist suggested I take some time off to reconnect with nature, I thought it was the perfect opportunity to escape the chaos of city life. Little did I know, I was trading one form of chaos for another, far more sinister one. I rented a modest RV from a local company, stocked up on supplies, and set off on a crisp autumn morning. The drive from Seattle to the Olympic National Park was scenic, with the evergreen forests lining the winding roads and the occasional glimpse of wildlife darting between the trees. As I drove deeper into the park, leaving the well-traveled routes behind, a sense of unease began to creep over me. The forest seemed to close in, the branches of ancient trees reaching out like gnarled fingers, scraping against the sides of my RV. After several hours of driving, I found what I thought was the perfect spot to set up camp. A small clearing nestled between towering Douglas firs, with a babbling stream nearby. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. I parked the RV, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and settled into a folding chair by the water's edge. As twilight descended, I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal of beans and hot dogs. The crackling flames and the gentle gurgle of the stream provided a soothing backdrop to my thoughts. For the first time in months, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. That night I slept fitfully, plagued by strange dreams of shadowy figures moving just beyond the edge of my vision. I woke several times, startled by unfamiliar sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, and once what sounded like whispered voices carried on the wind. I dismissed it as my mind playing tricks on me, unaccustomed to the sounds of the wilderness. The next morning I decided to explore the area on foot. The trails were barely visible, overgrown with ferns and moss. As I pushed deeper into the forest, the air grew thick and heavy, filled with the earthy scent of decaying vegetation. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the sunlight. After about an hour of hiking, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. An old, dilapidated cabin nestled in a small clearing. Its weathered wooden frame was covered in a thick layer of moss and lichen, the windows long since shattered. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, creaking ominously in the light breeze. Against my better judgment, I approached the cabin. Something about it drew me in, a morbid curiosity I couldn't shake. As I stepped inside, the floorboards groaned under my weight. The interior was a mess of broken furniture and debris, thick with dust and cobwebs. The air was heavy with the musty smell of decay and something else, a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. On a rickety table in the corner I found an old leather-bound journal. Its pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. With trembling hands I opened it and began to read. The journal belonged to a man named Lawrence Bennett, who had apparently lived in this cabin some years ago. The first entries were mundane, detailing Bennett's daily life in the wilderness, hunting, foraging, and maintaining his solitary existence. But as I flipped through the pages, the entries became increasingly erratic and disturbing. Bennett wrote of hearing voices in the woods, of shadowy figures watching him from between the trees. He described horrific nightmares and waking visions that left him questioning his sanity. The final entry made my heart race. May 15th, 1998. It's here. God help me, it's finally found me. I can hear it scratching at the walls, whispering my name. If anyone finds this, know that I tried to leave, but it's too late. It's coming for me, and soon it will come for you too. The forest has eyes, and once it sees you, it never lets go. The entry ended abruptly, a long ink streak trailing off the page, as if Bennett had been forcibly dragged away mid-sentence. I dropped the journal, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The rational part of my mind tried to dismiss it as the ravings of a man driven mad by isolation, but a primal fear had taken root in my chest. I hurried out of the cabin, feeling as though unseen eyes were boring into my back. As I made my way back to the campsite, the forest seemed different. The shadows were deeper, the silence more oppressive. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf made me jump. I could have sworn I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned to look, there was nothing but the endless sea of trees. Back at the RV, I locked the door and drew the curtains, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me. I told myself it was just an overactive imagination, fueled by an old madman's journal. But as night fell and darkness enveloped the clearing, I couldn't escape the sensation that something was out there, watching and waiting. Little did I know, my ordeal was just beginning. and the horrors that awaited me in the depths of the Olympic National Park would test the very limits of my sanity. As the night wore on, my anxiety grew. Every creak of the RV, every whisper of wind through the trees set my nerves on edge. I tried to distract myself by reading, but the words on the page blurred as my mind kept returning to that haunting journal entry. Around midnight I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps crunching on the gravel outside my RV, slow, deliberate steps that circled the vehicle. I held my breath, praying it was just an animal. But then came a sound that no animal could make, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to seep through the walls. Ethan Callahan. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. How did it know my name? I peered through a gap in the curtains, but the darkness outside was impenetrable. The footsteps continued their slow circuit around the RV, accompanied by that chilling whisper. Suddenly, something slammed against the side of the vehicle with enough force to rock it. I stifled a scream, fumbling for my phone with shaking hands. No signal. Of course there wasn't. I was miles from the nearest cell tower. The banging continued, growing more frenzied. I could hear the metal of the RV groaning under the assault. In desperation, I grabbed the keys and launched myself into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and I stomped on the accelerator, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from here. The RV lurched forward, branches scraping against the sides as I careened down the narrow forest road. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something. A tall, emaciated figure with impossibly long limbs, its face a hollow mask of darkness. It was running after the RV, moving with inhuman speed. I drove for what felt like hours, the road ahead barely visible in the weak glow of my headlights. The forest seemed endless, the trees pressing in on all sides. Several times I nearly ran off the road, the RV skidding on the loose gravel. As dawn began to break, I finally emerged onto a main road. The sun's first rays were like a lifeline, chasing away the terrors of the night. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, my hand still shaking as I turned off the engine. The elderly attendant gave me a concerned look as I stumbled out of the RV. "You all right there, son? Look like you've seen a ghost?" I managed a weak laugh. "Something like that. Had a bit of a rough night camping." He nodded knowingly. "Happens sometimes. The forest can play tricks on your mind, especially up in those remote areas. Where were you camping, if you don't mind me asking?" I described the location as best I could, and the old man's face grew serious. "That's near the old Bennett property. Folks around here don't go there much anymore. Not since what happened to the Lawrences." My blood ran cold. "The Lawrences?" The attendant leaned in, lowering his voice. "Family that went missing about 5 years back. Went camping up that way and never came home. Search parties found their campsite all torn up, but no sign of the family. Some say they heard screaming coming from the woods for days after, but no one could find the source." I felt the color drain from my face. The attendant must have noticed because he quickly added, "But that's just local gossip, you know. I'm sure it was nothing more than a bear or something." I nodded numbly, paid for my gas, and climbed back into the RV. As I pulled away from the station, I caught sight of something in my side mirror that made my heart stop. There at the edge of the forest behind the gas station stood a tall, skeletal figure. It raised one impossibly long arm, pointing directly at me. I slammed on the accelerator, the RV lurching forward as I sped away. But even as the miles stretched between me and that cursed forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Whatever I had encountered in those woods, whatever had happened to the Lawrences and to Lawrence Bennett before them, it wasn't content to stay confined to the Olympic National Park. As I drove back towards Seattle, my mind raced. What was that thing in the forest? How was it connected to the disappearances? And most chillingly, why had it fixated on me? Little did I know, my nightmare was far from over. The horrors I had experienced in the forest were just the beginning, and the true terror was yet to come. As I sped back towards Seattle, the events of the past few days played on repeat in my mind. The abandoned cabin, Bennett's journal, the terrifying encounter at my campsite, it all seemed too surreal to be true. Yet the visceral fear that gripped me was undeniable. I arrived home late in the afternoon, exhausted and on edge. My apartment, once a sanctuary from the stresses of work, now felt exposed and vulnerable. I double-checked all the locks and drew the curtains tight before collapsing into bed, hoping that a good night's sleep would help me process everything. But sleep brought no respite. My dreams were a chaotic swirl of dark forests and reaching shadows. I jolted awake several times, swearing I could hear that guttural whisper calling my name. By morning, I was more exhausted than when I'd gone to bed. The next few days passed in a haze of paranoia. I called in sick to work, unable to face the thought of leaving my apartment. I scoured the internet for information about the Olympic National Park and its history, looking for any mention of Lawrence Bennett or the missing Lawrence family. Most of what I found were tourist guides and nature photography, but buried in forum threads and local news archives, I discovered disturbing patterns. There had been dozens of disappearances in the park over the past century, far more than could be explained by normal wilderness accidents. Many of the missing persons cases shared eerie similarities, campers reporting being watched, strange noises in the night, and in a few cases journal entries or final messages describing a tall, shadowy figure. As I delved deeper into my research, strange things began happening around my apartment. Objects would move when I wasn't looking. I'd wake up to find all my cupboards open, and always there was the feeling of being watched. On the fourth night after my return, I woke to the sound of scratching at my bedroom window. My room was on the third floor. Heart pounding, I approached the window, telling myself it was probably just a tree branch. But as I drew back the curtain, I came face to face with a nightmare. Clinging to the outside of my building was the creature from the forest. In the harsh glare of the streetlights, I could see it clearly for the first time. Its body was emaciated, skin stretched tight over an impossible frame. Its arms and legs were grotesquely elongated, fingers ending in razor-sharp claws that dug into the brick. But its face was a void, a black hole that seemed to draw in all light and hope. I stumbled back, a scream caught in my throat. The creature pressed its featureless face against the glass, and though it had no mouth, I heard its voice inside my head. "You cannot escape, Ethan Callahan. The forest has chosen you." I ran from my room, from my apartment, from the building. I didn't stop running until I reached the 24-hour diner a few blocks away. The concerned waitress brought me coffee as I sat there, shaking and wild-eyed until dawn broke. I couldn't go back to my apartment. I couldn't stay in Seattle. Whatever this thing was, it had followed me from the forest, and I knew it wouldn't stop until it had me. With nowhere else to turn, I reached out to the only person I thought might be able to help, Dr. Eleanor Marsh, a professor of folklore and mythology at the University of Washington. I'd come across her name in my research, cited in a few articles about the legends of the Pacific Northwest. To my relief, Dr. Marsh agreed to meet with me that afternoon. As I sat in her cluttered office, surrounded by books on ancient myths and arcane symbols, I poured out my story. I expected disbelief, even ridicule, but the professor listened with growing concern. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment before speaking. "Mr. Callahan, what you've encountered is something I've been researching for years. The indigenous peoples of this region have legends of a forest spirit, a being they called the Wendigo. It's said to be a creature of insatiable hunger, not just for flesh, but for the very essence of a person." She pulled an old tome from her shelf, flipping to a page with a crude illustration. My blood ran cold. The spindly figure on the page was unmistakably the creature I'd seen. "The Wendigo is drawn to those who enter its domain," Dr. Marsh continued. "Once it has chosen a victim, it will pursue them relentlessly. But there might be a way to stop it." Hope flickered in my chest. "How?" "The legends speak of a ritual, a way to bind the Wendigo and send it back to the spirit realm. But it's dangerous, Mr. Callahan, and it would require returning to the forest." The thought of going back to that place filled me with dread. But as I looked out the window and saw a tall, shadowy figure standing motionless across the street, I knew I had no choice. "Tell me what I need to do," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. As Dr. Marsh began to explain the ritual, I steeled myself for what was to come. I was going back to the Olympic National Park, back to the heart of the forest where this nightmare began, and this time only one of us would be leaving alive. With Dr. Marsh's instructions burned into my memory and a bag full of ritual supplies, I set out for the Olympic National Park once more. The drive was tense, every mile bringing me closer to a confrontation I both dreaded and knew was inevitable. I arrived at the park as dusk was falling, the fading light casting long shadows across the landscape. I drove deep into the forest, following the same winding road that had led me to that fateful clearing days before. As I neared the spot, the air grew thick and oppressive, as if the forest itself was trying to push me out. I parked the RV in the clearing and began to set up for the ritual. Dr. Marsh had been explicit. The ceremony had to be performed at midnight, at the site where I had first encountered the Wendigo. As I worked, I could feel eyes on me, watching from the darkness between the trees. The hours crawled by, each minute stretching into an eternity. As midnight approached, the forest fell into an unnatural silence. No crickets chirped, no owls hooted. It was as if all of nature was holding its breath. At the stroke of midnight, I began the ritual. I lit the sacred herbs Dr. Marsh had given me, their pungent smoke filling the air. As I chanted the words she had taught me, an ancient language that felt strange and powerful on my tongue, the wind began to pick up, whipping through the trees with unnatural force. Suddenly, a blood-curdling shriek split the night. The Wendigo emerged from the forest, its elongated limbs carrying it with terrifying speed. But as it reached the edge of the ritual circle I had drawn, it stopped short, as if hitting an invisible barrier. The creature's featureless face contorted in what I can only describe as rage. It clawed at the air, trying to break through the protective circle. I continued the chant, my voice growing stronger as I saw the ritual working. But then something went wrong. The Wendigo let out another piercing cry, and I felt the barrier weaken. Dr. Marsh had warned me this might happen. The creature was ancient and powerful, and it wouldn't go down without a fight. In that moment, as the Wendigo pressed against the failing barrier, I realized the truth of what I had to do. The final part of the ritual required a sacrifice, not of blood but of fear. I had to face the creature, to look into the void of its face without flinching. With my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest, I stepped forward. The Wendigo loomed over me, its empty face inches from mine. I could feel its hunger, its ancient malevolence washing over me in waves. But I stood my ground. I stared into the abyss of its face, and in that moment I felt something shift. The fear that had gripped me for days began to ebb away, replaced by a calm determination. "You have no power over me," I said, my voice steady and clear. "This forest is not yours to claim, and neither am I." The Wendigo let out a shriek that shook the trees, but I didn't flinch. I continued the chant, never breaking eye contact with the creature. As the final words left my lips, a blinding light erupted from the ritual circle. The Wendigo's form began to waver like a mirage in the desert. It thrashed and wailed, its cries echoing through the forest, and then, with a final earth-shattering roar, it imploded, collapsing in on itself until nothing remained but a whisper of wind through the trees. As the light faded, I fell to my knees, exhausted but triumphant. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the forest lifted, and for the first time in days I felt like I could breathe freely. I spent the rest of the night in the clearing, too drained to move. As dawn broke, casting its golden light through the trees, I packed up my supplies and prepared to leave. But before I did, I made my way to the old cabin one last time. Inside, I found Bennett's journal where I had left it. I took it with me, feeling a responsibility to document what had happened here. As I turned to leave, I noticed something carved into the cabin wall, hidden behind years of grime and decay. Brushing away the dirt, I revealed a message. "To those who come after, know that the forest sees all, but we are not powerless against its horrors. Face your fears, and you will find your strength." I traced the words with my fingers, feeling a connection to all those who had faced this terror before me. Then I walked out of the cabin and back to my RV, leaving the Olympic National Park behind. In the months that followed, I worked with Dr. Marsh to document my experience and research other instances of the Wendigo across the country. We created a network of people dedicated to helping those who might encounter such entities, offering support and guidance. I still camp and hike, but now I do so with open eyes, aware of the hidden worlds that exist alongside our own. The experience changed me, showed me the darkness that can lurk in the wilderness, but also the strength that lies within each of us. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think I can still hear the whisper of the wind through the trees, carrying echoes of ancient secrets. But I no longer fear the darkness. I faced it, and I survived. And in doing so, I found a part of myself I never knew existed, a wellspring of courage and resilience that no monster, no matter how terrifying, could ever take away. It happened in the year 2000. I never thought I'd be telling this story, but the weight of it has been crushing me for far too long. I need to get it out, to share the horror of what I experienced in those God-forsaken woods. Maybe then I can finally start to heal. My name is Alex, and I'm a 38-year-old software developer from Seattle. Back then I was going through a rough patch. My wife of 10 years had left me for her yoga instructor, and my job at a soul-crushing tech startup was slowly killing me. I needed an escape, a chance to clear my head and reset. That's when I decided to take an RV camping trip to Whispering Pines, a remote area in the Cascade Mountains. I'd been planning this trip for months, meticulously researching the perfect spot. Whispering Pines was ideal, far enough from civilization to offer solitude, but close enough to the small town of Pinecrest if I needed supplies. I didn't have many friends left, just a few guys from college I'd occasionally grab a beer with. None of them could join me on this trip, which was fine. I needed to be alone. The day I set out, the sky was overcast, matching my mood. The drive took about 4 hours, winding through dense forests and along steep mountain roads. As I neared my destination, the trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off as pre-trip jitters. I arrived at the campsite in the late morning. The area was breathtaking, a pristine lake surrounded by towering pines, their reflections shimmering on the water's surface. I parked my RV near the shore and stepped out, taking a deep breath of the crisp mountain air. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of peace. As I set up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustling leaf or snapping twig made me jump. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind, but a nagging sense of unease persisted. I spent the afternoon fishing from a rickety old dock, the gentle lapping of the water against the shore almost hypnotic. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I heard a noise behind me. Turning, I saw a man emerging from the woods. He looked to be in his early 40s with a scraggly beard and wild, darting eyes. His clothes were torn and filthy, as if he'd been living in the wilderness for weeks. As he approached, I caught a whiff of body odor and something else, a sickly sweet smell I couldn't quite place. "Hey there," he called out, his voice raspy and uncertain. "Name's Cole. Been out here a while, ran out of supplies. You wouldn't happen to have any food to spare, would you?" I felt a pang of sympathy for the guy. He looked like he'd been through hell. "Sure thing, man," I replied, reeling in my line. "I've got some stuff back at the RV. Come on." As we walked back to my campsite, Cole kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone or something to be following us. I tried to make small talk, but he was evasive about his past and how he'd ended up out here alone. I dug out some canned goods and a couple of beers from my supplies. Cole devoured the food like a starving animal, barely pausing to breathe between bites. As night fell, I offered to let him stay, figuring he could use a proper rest. We sat around the campfire, sipping beers and making stilted conversation. Cole seemed to relax a bit, but there was still something off about him. His eyes never stopped moving, scanning the tree line as if searching for hidden threats. As the fire died down, I showed Cole to the couch in the RV and took the bed in the back for myself. I drifted off to sleep, exhausted from the day's activities and the strange encounter. I jolted awake in the dead of night, heart pounding. Something was wrong. The RV door was wide open, swinging gently in the breeze. Cole was gone. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside. The beam cut through the inky darkness, revealing fresh footprints leading into the woods. "Cole?" I called out, my voice echoing in the still night air. No response. Against my better judgment, I followed the tracks. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches clawing at my clothes. The footprints led me deeper and deeper into the woods until I nearly tripped over something on the ground. It was a tattered backpack, its contents spilled out on the forest floor. Among the scattered items, I found a wallet containing an ID. It belonged to a young man named Victor, in his mid-20s. My blood ran cold as I realized Cole wasn't who he claimed to be. Panic surged through me, but I pressed on, following the tracks until they ended at the edge of a steep ravine. Shining my flashlight down, I saw something glinting between the rocks below. Carefully, I made my way down and retrieved the object. Another ID, this one belonging to a woman named Lisa, also in her 20s. A terrifying picture was forming in my mind. The sound of a twig snapping behind me made me whirl around, my flashlight beam illuminating Cole's face. His eyes were wild, filled with a mixture of desperation and madness. In his hand, he clutched a wicked-looking hunting knife. "Found my little collection, did you?" he snarled, taking a step closer. "What's going on, Cole?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "What did you do?" "They were lost, just like me," he said, his voice a dangerous whisper. "I helped them and they stayed with me, forever." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Cole had lured these people here just like he'd done with me. And then, what? Killed them? Kept their IDs as trophies? Without thinking, I turned and ran. I could hear Cole crashing through the underbrush behind me, his ragged breathing getting closer. I stumbled and fell, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and rolling away into the darkness. Scrambling to my feet, I ran blindly through the woods. Branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging cuts. I burst out onto the dirt road leading back to my campsite, desperation giving me speed. I could see the outline of my RV ahead, a beacon of safety in the darkness. I reached it just as Cole emerged from the tree line, his face twisted in rage. I dove inside, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My hands shaking, I fumbled with the keys, finally managing to start the engine. I floored the gas pedal, tires spinning in the dirt before finding traction. As I sped away, I saw Cole in the rearview mirror, standing in the middle of the road. He hurled the knife at the RV, but it bounced harmlessly off the metal. I didn't stop driving until I reached Pinecrest, my heart still pounding in my chest. I went straight to the police station and told them everything. They were skeptical at first, but the IDs I'd found, and the wild look in my eyes convinced them to take me seriously. A search party was sent out to Whispering Pines. They found Cole's makeshift camp deep in the woods, along with the remains of at least 3 people near the ravine where I'd found the IDs. But Cole himself was nowhere to be found. I gave my statement to the police and left town as soon as they cleared me to go. I didn't want to stick around for the grisly details of their investigation. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. The drive home was a blur. My mind kept replaying the events of that night, Cole's crazed eyes haunting my thoughts. I wondered how many others he'd lured into his trap, how many more victims were out there in those dark woods. When I finally got home, I parked the RV and went inside, locking every door and window. I didn't sleep that night, or for many nights after. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Cole's face, heard his rasping voice. It's been 5 years since that night in Whispering Pines. The police never found Cole, and sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, luring unsuspecting campers to their doom. I've tried to move on with my life, but the experience changed me forever. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone, and I always keep a gun within reach just in case. Because I know now that the real monsters aren't the ones in stories or movies. They're the ones hiding in plain sight, wearing a friendly face and offering help when you're at your most vulnerable. So if you're ever out in the wilderness and a stranger approaches, offering food or shelter, think twice, because you never know when you might become just another ID in someone's twisted collection. It happened in the year 1987. I was a young journalist then, fresh out of college and eager to make my mark in the world of investigative reporting. Little did I know that my first big story would lead me down a path of unimaginable horror, forever changing the course of my life and haunting me to this day. I had been assigned to cover a series of mysterious disappearances in the Appalachian Mountains. Over the past decade, dozens of hikers and campers had vanished without a trace in a remote area known as Devil's Hollow. Local authorities were baffled, and rumors of everything from serial killers to supernatural entities ran rampant among the nearby communities. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to go undercover as a solo camper. I rented an RV, packed enough supplies for a week, and set out for Devil's Hollow on a crisp autumn morning. The drive was long and winding, taking me deeper into the heart of the mountains. As I neared my destination, an oppressive silence seemed to descend upon the landscape. Even the birds had fallen quiet. I arrived at the campground in the late afternoon. It was a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, with a murky lake at its center. A weathered sign read, "Welcome to Devil's Hollow. Camp at your own risk." A chill ran down my spine as I parked the RV near the water's edge. As I set up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The trees seemed to loom over me, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I tried to rationalize my unease, chalking it up to the stories I'd heard and the eerie atmosphere of the place. Night fell quickly, and I built a small fire to ward off the encroaching darkness. The flames cast flickering shadows across the campground, making the trees dance in a macabre waltz. I was about to turn in for the night when I heard a rustling in the underbrush. A man emerged from the shadows, his appearance so sudden and silent that I nearly jumped out of my skin. He was gaunt and wild-eyed, with matted hair and tattered clothing. "Got any food to spare?" he asked, his voice a raspy whisper. Against my better judgment, I invited him to share my campfire and offered him some canned goods from the RV. He introduced himself as Marcus and claimed to be a lost hiker. As he wolfed down the food, I studied his face in the firelight. There was something unsettling about his eyes, a feverish gleam that sent shivers down my spine. Marcus began to tell me about the history of Devil's Hollow, speaking in a low, urgent tone. He spoke of ancient Native American legends, of a malevolent spirit that haunted these woods, luring in unsuspecting victims and feeding on their fear. I listened, captivated and horrified, as he wove his tale. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to overtake me. Despite my unease, I offered Marcus the couch in the RV while I took the bed in the back. Sleep came fitfully, filled with nightmares of shadowy figures and echoing screams. I awoke with a start in the dead of night, my heart pounding. The RV door was wide open, and Marcus was gone. Grabbing a flashlight, I ventured outside, calling his name. The beam of light cut through the inky darkness, revealing fresh footprints leading into the woods. Against my better judgment, I followed the trail. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches scratching at my face and clothes. The air grew thick and oppressive, filled with a sickly sweet odor that made my stomach churn. The footprints led me to a small clearing where I made a horrifying discovery. The ground was littered with personal belongings, backpacks, wallets, clothing, all in various states of decay. With trembling hands, I picked up a nearby wallet and opened it. The ID inside belonged to a young woman who had been reported missing over a year ago. Panic seized me as I realized the true nature of the horror I had stumbled upon. This wasn't just a campground, it was a killing field. And Marcus... A twig snapped behind me and I whirled around. Marcus stood at the edge of the clearing, but he was transformed. His eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and his body seemed to shift and writhe, as if something inside was trying to break free. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice no longer human. "But now that you have, you'll never leave." I ran. Branches whipped at my face as I tore through the underbrush, the sound of inhuman laughter echoing behind me. I could hear something crashing through the woods in pursuit, something far larger and faster than any man. Somehow I made it back to the RV. With shaking hands I fumbled with the keys, finally getting the engine started. As I sped away from Devil's Hollow, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, a massive, shadowy form with glowing eyes, standing at the edge of the woods. I drove through the night, not stopping until I reached the nearest police station. My story was met with skepticism at first, but when I led them back to the clearing, They found evidence of multiple murders spanning decades. The case made national headlines, but no trace of Marcus or the other victims was ever found. The campground was cordoned off, declared off-limits, but the disappearances continued in other parts of the Appalachian Mountains. As for me, I gave up journalism shortly after. The horrors I witnessed in Devil's Hollow haunted my dreams and waking hours alike. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me out of those woods. Sometimes on dark nights I swear I can hear distant inhuman laughter on the wind, and I know that the evil in Devil's Hollow is still out there, waiting for its next victim. It happened in the year 2019. I never thought I'd be telling this story, but here I am, my hand shaking as I type these words. The memories of that summer still haunt me, vivid and terrifying. I'm sharing this now as a warning to others who might think that nature is just a playground, that the wilderness is merely a backdrop for Instagram photos and campfire stories. I learned the hard way that sometimes the horrors lurking in the shadows are all too real. My name is Alex, and I was 28 years old when it all began. I had a decent job in marketing, lived in a cramped apartment in the city, and spent most of my days staring at screens, juggling deadlines, and drowning in the endless noise of urban life. The stress was getting to me, seeping into my bones and fraying my nerves. That's when my old college buddy Ron suggested we take a camping trip. 2 weeks in the woods, man, he said, his eyes lighting up with excitement. No cell service, no emails, no bosses breathing down our necks. Just us, nature, and a well-stocked RV. What do you say? It sounded perfect. A chance to disconnect, to breathe in fresh air instead of car exhaust, to see stars instead of streetlights. I agreed without hesitation, envisioning peaceful days spent fishing by a crystal-clear lake and nights around a crackling campfire. Little did I know that this trip would become the stuff of nightmares. A horror that would change us forever. We rented an RV, packed it with supplies, and set off on a sunny Saturday morning in late June. The drive took us through winding mountain roads, the cityscape gradually giving way to dense forests and rugged terrain. As we ventured deeper into the wilderness, a sense of isolation settled over us. It was both exhilarating and slightly unnerving. After several hours of driving, we found the perfect spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing near the edge of a dense forest, miles away from the nearest town. A serene lake shimmered in the distance, its surface like polished glass reflecting the azure sky. The air was thick with the scent of pine and wildflowers. Wildlife scurried about, squirrels darting between trees, birds calling to each other in the canopy above. It seemed idyllic, a postcard-perfect scene of natural beauty. We parked the RV and began to set up our campsite. Ron and I worked together to unfold chairs, set up a portable grill, and gather firewood. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across our little clearing, we sat back with cold beers in hand, admiring our handiwork. "This is it, Alex," Ron said, grinning. 2 weeks of paradise. No deadlines, no traffic, no noise. Just us and Mother Nature. I nodded, feeling the tension of city life already beginning to melt away. "I can't remember the last time I saw so many stars," I mused, gazing up at the darkening sky. The Milky Way was becoming visible, a river of light stretching across the heavens. That first night, we sat around the campfire, sharing stories and laughing until our sides hurt. The crackling of the flames, the chirping of crickets, and the occasional hoot of an owl created a soothing symphony of wilderness sounds. As I crawled into my sleeping bag that night, I felt a profound sense of peace. This, I thought, was exactly what I needed. The next few days were blissful. We spent our time hiking through the woods, discovering hidden streams and breathtaking vistas. We fished in the lake, our lines cutting silver arcs through the air as we cast. In the evenings, we'd return to our campsite, cook our catch over the fire, and talk late into the night. It felt like we were the only two people in the world, living in perfect harmony with nature. But on the fourth day, everything changed. We decided to explore a new trail we had discovered the day before. It snaked through the forest and up a gentle hill, promising spectacular views from the top. As we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air seemed to grow colder with each step, despite the summer heat. The trees became denser, their branches intertwining above us to form a thick canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. An eerie twilight settled over the trail, even though it was barely past noon. "Is it just me, or does something feel weird?" I asked Ron, trying to keep my voice casual. He nodded, his eyes darting from tree to tree. "Yeah, it's like, I don't know, like we're being watched or something." I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. "Come on, it's probably just our imaginations. Too many horror movies, right?" Ron forced a smile, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. We pressed on, the path growing steeper and more overgrown. The usual sounds of the forest, birdsong, rustling leaves, the scurrying of small animals, had faded away, replaced by an oppressive silence. Our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. After what felt like hours of climbing, the path finally leveled out, leading us to a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, its weathered boards gray with age. Windows, their glass long since shattered, gaped like empty eye sockets. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, creaking softly in the faint breeze. "Holy shit," Ron whispered, his eyes wide. "What the hell is this place?" I shook my head, unable to take my eyes off the decrepit structure. "No idea. Looks like it's been abandoned for years." We approached cautiously, leaves and twigs crunching beneath our feet. The cabin seemed to loom larger with each step, its presence oppressive and somehow malevolent. As we drew closer, I noticed strange markings carved into the wood around the doorframe. Symbols I didn't recognize, but which sent a chill down my spine. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested, my mouth suddenly dry. "This place gives me the creeps." But Ron was already peering through one of the broken windows. "Come on, Alex, where's your sense of adventure? This is cool. It's like something out of a horror movie." Those words would come back to haunt us. Against my better judgment, I followed Ron as he pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was a study in decay. Dust motes danced in the few shafts of light that penetrated the gloom. Cobwebs hung from every corner, and the floorboards groaned ominously beneath our feet. The air was thick with the musty smell of rot and abandonment. As our eyes adjusted to the dim light, details began to emerge. An old iron stove stood in one corner, its surface pitted with rust. A wooden table, one leg broken, lay on its side in the center of the room, and everywhere, covering the walls and scattered across the floor, were photographs. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. All in black and white, their edges curled and yellow with age. I picked one up, blowing off a layer of dust. It showed a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children, standing in front of this very cabin. But something was wrong with the image. The faces were distorted somehow, stretched and twisted in a way that made my stomach churn. "Ron," I called, my voice shaking, "you need to see this." He came over, taking the photo from my trembling hands. "What the hell?" he muttered, squinting at the image. "It's like their faces are melting or something." We moved from photo to photo, each one more disturbing than the last. Some showed the family in various poses around the cabin and the surrounding woods. Others depicted strange rituals, figures in robes standing in circles of candles. And in every single one, the faces were wrong, stretched, twisted, or blurred beyond recognition. As we examined the photos, a sense of dread began to build in the pit of my stomach. It felt like the temperature in the cabin had dropped by several degrees. The silence outside seemed to press in on us, broken only by the pounding of my heart. That's when we heard it. A soft thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch outside. Ron and I froze, our eyes meeting in shared panic. The footsteps grew louder, slower, more deliberate. They stopped just outside the door. For a long moment, nothing happened. We stood there, barely breathing, staring at the crooked door. Then, slowly, it began to open. A figure stood in the doorway, backlit by the dim forest light. Tall and gaunt, it seemed more shadow than substance. As it took a step forward, I caught a glimpse of its face, or rather, where its face should have been. Instead, there was only a smooth, featureless expanse of pale skin. A scream built in my throat, but before it could escape, the figure lunged forward with inhuman speed. I felt a sharp pain in my neck, and then darkness. I awoke to the sound of dripping water. My head throbbed, and every muscle in my body ached. As I tried to move, I realized with growing horror that I was bound tightly to a chair. Blinking away the bleariness, I found myself in what appeared to be a basement. The walls were rough stone, slick with moisture. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows across the room. "Ron?" I called out, my voice hoarse. "Ron, are you here?" A muffled groan answered me. Turning my head, I saw Ron tied to another chair a few feet away. His face was bruised, a trickle of dried blood running from his temple. "Alex?" he mumbled, his eyes struggling to focus. Where are we?" Before I could answer, a door creaked open behind us. Heavy footsteps approached, slow and measured. A figure stepped into view, the same tall, gaunt shape we had seen in the cabin. But now, in the harsh light of the basement, I could see it clearly. It was a man, or at least it had been once. His skin was pale and waxy, stretched tight over prominent bones. Where his eyes should have been were only smooth, unbroken expanses of flesh. His mouth was a lipless slit, opening to reveal rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. "Welcome," the thing said, its voice a dry rasp that sent shivers down my spine. "Welcome to my home." As it spoke, more figures emerged from the shadows. They were similar in appearance, all with that same featureless face, that same too-wide mouth filled with needle-like teeth. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, circling us like predators stalking prey. "What do you want from us?" I managed to choke out, fighting against the terror that threatened to overwhelm me. The first creature tilted its head, a gesture almost bird-like in its abruptness. "Want?" it repeated, as if tasting the word. "We want what we have always wanted, to feed, to grow, to spread." It leaned in close, and I gagged at the smell of rot that wafted from its lipless mouth. "You see," it continued, "we have been here for a very long time, waiting, watching. The forest provides, but not often enough, not nearly enough." One of the other creatures stepped forward, holding something in its hands. With a jolt of horror, I realized it was a camera, an old Polaroid model, incongruously modern among these ancient horrors. "Smile," the first creature said, its mouth stretching into a grotesque parody of a grin. "You're about to become part of our family album." The flash went off, momentarily blinding me. As my vision cleared, I saw the creature examining the developing photo with what seemed like satisfaction. "Perfect," it hissed. "Just perfect. Your fear, it's exquisite. It will sustain us for years to come." As it spoke, I felt a strange sensation creeping across my skin. It started as an itch, then grew into a burning pain. I looked down at my arms in horror, watching as my flesh seemed to ripple and shift, as if something was moving beneath the surface. Ron's agonized scream told me he was experiencing the same thing. I turned to look at him, only to recoil in shock. His face was changing. The features were melting, running like wax, reforming into something alien and terrible. "What's happening to us?" I cried out, my own voice distorting as I felt the changes begin to affect my mouth, my throat. The creature leaned in close again, its featureless face inches from mine. "You're becoming like us," it whispered. "Eternal, hungry, free from the constraints of humanity." As the pain intensified, as I felt my very being begin to unravel and reform, I realized the true horror of our situation. This wasn't just about death. This was about transformation, about becoming something other. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the sound of a camera flash, preserving the moment of our metamorphosis for whatever passed as posterity among these forest dwellers. I don't know how long I was out. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that dank basement. When I finally came to, everything had changed. My body felt wrong, alien. I could move, but my limbs didn't respond quite the way I expected them to, and my senses, they were overwhelmed. I could smell the fear lingering in the air, could taste the despair on my tongue. I turned to look at Ron, only to recoil in horror. Where my friend had been was now a creature similar to our captors. Its skin was pale and waxy, its face a smooth expanse broken only by a wide, tooth-filled mouth. But in its movements, in the way it tilted its head, I could still see echoes of Ron. "Alex?" It spoke, and the voice was a twisted version of my friend's. "What? What have we become?" Before I could respond, could I even speak anymore, the door creaked open once more. Our original captor entered, followed by several others. They regarded us with what I could only interpret as satisfaction. "The transformation is complete," the leader said, its voice a dry whisper. "Welcome to the family." Over the next few days, weeks, months, we learned the truth of our new existence. We were part of something ancient, something that had dwelt in these woods long before humans came, a parasitic entity that needed fear and suffering to survive, that spread by transforming its victims into creatures like itself. The cabin, we discovered, was a lure, a trap to draw in unsuspecting campers and hikers. The photos were both a record and a source of sustenance, each captured moment of terror providing energy for the collective. And now we were part of it, bound to the forest, to the endless cycle of luring, capturing, and transforming. Our human memories faded a little more each day, replaced by an all-consuming hunger. But some part of me, some tiny spark of my old self, refused to be extinguished. And so I found a way to write this account, to warn others. If you're reading this, if you found this story, run. Run far away from these woods. Because the trees have eyes, the shadows have teeth, and every snapshot holds a soul in torment. And if you see an old cabin in the woods, if you find yourself drawn to investigate, remember us. Remember what we became, and know that the same fate awaits you if you dare to step inside. The horror doesn't end when the story does. It lives on in the rustle of leaves, in the snap of a twig underfoot, in the flash of a camera in the dark. The woods are watching, always watching, and they're hungry for new additions to the family album. I've always loved camping and hiking. There's something about the crisp air, the rustling of leaves, and the sense of adventure that comes with exploring nature that has always called to me. But after what happened to me a few years ago, just outside of Flagstaff, Arizona, I'm not sure I'll ever look at the great outdoors the same way again. My name is Jason, and I'm what you'd call an experienced hiker. I've tackled trails all across the country, from the Appalachian Trail to the Pacific Crest. I thought I'd seen it all, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in those ponderosa pine forests. It was early autumn when my buddy Orson reached out to me. "Hey Jason," he said, his voice crackling with excitement over the phone. "I've got a trail you've got to check out. It's off-grid, barely known. You in?" I didn't even hesitate. "Absolutely," I replied, already mentally packing my gear. We met up in Flagstaff a week later. The town was bustling with tourists and college students, but we were headed away from all that. Our destination lay beyond the well-trodden paths, in the heart of the Coconino National Forest. As we drove out of town, the landscape transformed. The urban sprawl gave way to towering ponderosa pines, their bark a rich reddish-brown against the azure sky. The air grew thinner, crisper, filled with the scent of pine needles and sun-baked earth. It was intoxicating. We parked at an unmarked trailhead, just a small clearing off a dusty forest road. "This is it," Orson said, shouldering his pack. "You ready for this?" I grinned, feeling that familiar rush of adrenaline that comes with starting a new adventure. Born ready. The trail started innocently enough. It was rough, sure, all exposed roots and loose rocks, but nothing we couldn't handle. We hiked for hours, the forest growing denser around us. The canopy above filtered the sunlight, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. It was late afternoon when things started to get strange. We had stopped for a quick break, munching on protein bars and rehydrating, when I saw it, a glint in the underbrush maybe 50 yards off the trail. It caught the sun just right, winking at me like a secret waiting to be discovered. "Hey, Orson," I said, pointing. "You see that?" He squinted in the direction I was indicating. "See what? Come on, man, we should keep moving. It'll be dark soon." But curiosity had already sunk its hooks into me. "I'm just gonna check it out real quick. Won't take a minute." Ignoring Orson's protests, I pushed through the underbrush. Branches whipped at my face, thorns snagged my clothes, but I pressed on. When I reached the spot where I'd seen the glint, my blood ran cold. It wasn't a lost piece of jewelry or a discarded soda can as I'd half expected. It was a bone. A large bone, bleached white by the sun and eerily clean. Too big for a deer, too strange in shape for any animal I recognized. One end had a bizarre, knobby protrusion that sent a shiver down my spine. I should have left it there. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to rejoin Orson on the trail and forget I'd ever seen it. But some morbid fascination took hold. Before I knew what I was doing, I'd picked up the bone and slipped it into my pack. "Jason?" Orson's voice came from behind me, tinged with concern. "What the hell, man? We need to stick to the trail." I turned to him, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sorry. Thought I saw something. Let's keep going." But as we continued our hike, something had changed. The forest, which had seemed so alive and vibrant earlier, now felt oppressive. The bird songs that had accompanied us all day faded away, replaced by an unsettling silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. We pushed on, the trail becoming steeper, more challenging. Sweat beaded on my forehead, but I felt cold inside. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush set my nerves on edge. Then we heard it. A crack, like a gunshot in the silence. We both froze, eyes wide, scanning the forest around us. "What was that?" Orson whispered, his face pale. I shook my head, unable to speak. That's when I noticed the clearing ahead, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. And in that clearing, I wish I could say my mind was playing tricks on me, that the fading light in our frayed nerves had conjured up a monster from our deepest fears. But what I saw was all too real. It was hunched over something, its back to us. Even from a distance I could see it was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall if it stood upright. Its skin was a sickly pallid gray, hanging in loose folds over a skeletal frame. Patchy fur clung to its body in clumps, like a mangy dog. But it was what it was doing that turned my blood to ice. It was feeding. On what, I couldn't tell at first, but as it shifted I caught a glimpse of a hiking boot. A human leg, being systematically stripped of flesh by row upon row of razor-sharp teeth. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a whimper, I don't know. But suddenly it stopped. Its head snapped around, fixing us with eyes like black marbles. Its muzzle was long, canine-like, but distorted, wrong. And those teeth, God, those teeth. They filled its mouth in irregular rows, some as long as my fingers, others small and needle-like. For a heartbeat we all froze. Orson and I in terror, the creature in what I can only describe as hungry anticipation. Then Orson screamed. The sound shattered the moment. The creature lunged, moving with a speed that defied its size. We ran. I've never run so hard in my life. We tore through the forest, heedless of the trail, of direction, of anything but the primal need to escape. Branches whipped our faces, thorns tore at our clothes and skin, but we didn't slow down. Behind us I could hear it, the snapping of branches, the thunderous impact of its footfalls, and that sound, part growl, part roar, but with an almost human quality that chilled me to my core. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs threatened to give out. Somehow, miraculously, we found ourselves back on a main trail. We collapsed by a signpost, gasping for air, as a group of day hikers strolled by, giving us odd looks. We went to the rangers, of course, told them we'd gotten lost, seen something. But how do you describe what we saw without sounding insane? They nodded politely, probably chalking it up to dehydration and an overactive imagination. Orson quit hiking after that. Says he prefers the safety of the city now. I can't blame him. As for me, I still hike, but only on well-populated trails in broad daylight. I sold most of my camping gear. The bone? I lost it somewhere in our mad dash through the forest. Part of me is glad. Who knows what kind of curse or bad juju that thing might have carried. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet of the night, I swear I can hear it. That inhuman growl, that mix of animal hunger and human intelligence. And I wonder, what if it followed us out of that forest? What if it's still out there hunting? I love camping and hiking, at least I used to. Now every time I set foot on a trail, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me from just beyond the tree line, waiting, hungry, and I wonder, will I be next? wind howled through the pines, carrying with it the scent of snow and something else, something primal and wrong. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me as I stared out at the vast expanse of Medicine Bow National Forest. The drilling rig behind me creaked and groaned, a man-made monster against the backdrop of nature's domain. But as I was about to learn, there were far more terrifying things lurking in these woods than mere machines. My name's Riker, and this is the story of how I nearly lost my life and my sanity in the oil fields of Wyoming. I drifted into the job like I drifted into everything else in my life, young, restless, and with no real plan beyond making it to the next paycheck. The work was grueling, the hours long, and the men I worked with were a rough bunch. Most of us were running from something, failed marriages, mounting debts, or just the gnawing emptiness of a life without purpose. We found solace in cheap whiskey and camaraderie, forged in the harsh conditions of the oil fields. Our latest assignment had brought us to the edge of Medicine Bow, a sprawling wilderness that seemed to stretch on forever. As we set up our camp, a collection of metal trailers, a makeshift canteen, and the towering rig itself, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were trespassing. The locals in the nearby town had been oddly tight-lipped about the area, offering only vague warnings about old native legends and missing hunters. I should have paid more attention to those whispered tales. Maybe then I could have prevented what was to come. The first few days passed without incident, save for the usual mishaps that come with establishing a new drilling site. But as we settled into a routine, strange occurrences began to pile up. Tools would go missing overnight, only to turn up in odd places, balanced precariously on tree branches, or half buried in the soft earth at the forest's edge. At first we blamed it on forgetfulness or practical jokes. Oil field work isn't for the faint of heart, and gallows humor is how many of us cope. But then came the shadows. It started with Zeke, one of the younger guys on the crew. He came stumbling into the canteen one morning, eyes wild and bloodshot. "I saw something out there," he stammered, hands shaking as he poured himself a mug of coffee. "Big as a truck, moving on all fours. It was watching me." We laughed it off, of course. Zeke had a reputation for hitting the bottle hard, and we figured he'd had one too many the night before. But I couldn't shake the chill that ran down my spine when he described the creature's eyes, yellow and intelligent, filled with a hunger that went beyond mere animal instinct. As the days wore on, more of us began to notice things. A flicker of movement just beyond the floodlight's reach. The sensation of being watched whenever we ventured too close to the tree line, and always, that low guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very air around us. We tried to rationalize it. The isolation was getting to us, we said. The long hours and the unforgiving landscape were playing tricks on our minds. But deep down we all knew something was terribly wrong. Then Tom disappeared. Tom was one of the old-timers, a grizzled veteran of a dozen different oil fields. He wasn't the type to spook easily or to wander off without telling anyone. But one morning he went to check on a pump at the far end of the site and never came back. We organized a search party, fanning out into the woods with rifles and flashlights. The forest seemed to swallow up our shouts, the thick canopy above muffling any hope of echo. As the day wore on and the shadows lengthened, a sickening realization began to set in. We weren't going to find Tom. That night, huddled around the fire pit outside the trailers, no one spoke above a whisper. The usual banter and rough jokes were replaced by nervous glances and twitchy hands that never strayed far from our weapons. The foreman doubled the watch shifts, but it did little to ease the tension that hung over us like a shroud. I was just starting to drift off when the screams began. They came from the direction of the rig, high-pitched and terrified. Then came the gunshots, a frantic volley that lit up the night. I was on my feet in an instant, shotgun in hand as I raced towards the sound. But by the time I reached the site, it was already too late. 2 more of our crew were gone, vanished as completely as if the earth had opened up and swallowed them whole. All that remained were a few spent shell casings and dark stains on the gravel that I prayed weren't blood. Panic set in then, a primal fear that overrode any semblance of reason or protocol. We grabbed what we could carry and set off towards the highway, abandoning the site and all thoughts of finishing the job. The forest pressed in around us, every snapping twig and rustling leaf a potential harbinger of doom. We stuck to open spaces when we could, our eyes constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The attack we all feared never came, but the knowledge that we were being hunted, that something out there was toying with us, was almost worse than a direct confrontation. When we finally reached the highway and made contact with the state troopers, we spun a tale of a rogue bear attack. It was easier than trying to explain the truth, easier than admitting that we'd encountered something that defied explanation. It wasn't until later, holed up in a dingy motel room and trying to scrub the mud and fear from my skin, that I noticed the footprints. They were pressed into the dried mud on my boots, massive impressions that sent a chill through me as I realized what I was looking at. They were far too large to belong to any normal predator, with an unnatural number of toes splayed out in a pattern I'd never seen before, and there was something about the depth of the impressions, the way they sunk into the earth, that spoke of a weight beyond anything known to science. The official reports in the following days were maddeningly vague. Search and rescue teams found no trace of our missing crew members, and the company was quick to shut down any talk of supernatural occurrences. We were given our severance pay and a stern warning to keep our mouths shut about what had happened out there. For years afterward, I drifted from job to job, never staying in one place for too long. I slept with a shotgun under my bed and jumped at shadows, always half expecting to see those yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness. One night, driving a lonely stretch of highway in New Mexico, I saw it again. A massive shape loped across the road ahead of me, moving with that same unnatural gait I'd glimpsed in the Wyoming woods. In the split second before it vanished into the scrub, I caught a glimpse of matted fur and those haunting, intelligent eyes. I didn't stop driving until I hit the next town, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. These days I've settled into city life. The constant noise and light provide a comforting barrier against the memories of what lurks in the dark places of the world. But on quiet nights, when the wind whistles just right, I still hear the snap of branches and the guttural growl of something ancient and hungry. The truth is, you can run from the horrors that dwell in those remote wilderness areas. You can surround yourself with the trappings of civilization and try to forget. But you can't escape the knowledge that out there, beyond the reach of cell phone signals and GPS, there are things that remind us of our true place in the natural order. We like to think we've tamed the world, that our technology and our weapons make us the apex predators. But in those vast primordial forests, we're nothing more than prey. And sometimes, if we're very unlucky, we come face to face with the things that hunt in the shadows, the things that have been waiting, watching, and hungering since long before mankind first crawled out of the muck. I don't know what attacked us in Wyoming that night. I don't want to know. But I do know this. The next time you find yourself on the edge of the wilderness, watching the sun sink below the tree line, listen closely. And if you hear a low, rumbling growl that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, run. Run, and don't look back. Because in this world there are far worse things than death, and some of them are always hungry.